There are places folded into the bruised knuckles of the Appalachian Mountains where time does not flow, it curdles. Valleys where sunlight arrives late and leaves early, and the fog clings to the hollows like a possessive ghost. In the autumn of 1903, Dr. Alastair Finch arrived in just such a place, Morning Creek, Virginia, a town whose name felt less like a geographical marker and more like a statement of permanent condition. He had come to fill the position of the old doctor, a man who had apparently died not of any discernible ailment, but from the simple, crushing weight of accumulated decades. Finch, young and brimming with the clean, quantifiable certainties of modern medicine learned in Boston, saw the town as a challenge, a place to bring light. He could not have known that Morning Creek did not want light. It had its own customs, its own truths, and its own darkness, which it guarded with a chilling, communal vigilance. The town itself was a study in slow decay. Weather-beaten, clapboard houses leaned into one another for support, their porches sagging like tired shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of coal, smoke, damp earth, and something else, something akin to resignation. But what drew Finch's eye, what commanded his attention from the moment he arrived, was the house on the hill. Set apart from the huddle of the town, Blackwood Manor clawed at the gray sky with skeletal, leafless oaks. It was a severe, Gothic structure of dark stone and pointed gables, its windows like vacant eyes staring down at the valley. It was the home of Gideon Blackwood, the town's patriarch, its largest landowner, its unspoken sovereign. The whispers about the Blackwood place began almost immediately, faint and furtive, exchanged in the hushed corners of the general store or behind a hand at the post office. They were whispers of wealth, of influence, but also of sorrow. They spoke of Gideon's wife, who had withered away from a malady no one could name, and of his two daughters, Alara and Maeve. The official story, the one offered by the stony-faced Sheriff Miller and the perpetually sighing Reverend Thompson, was that the girls, afflicted with a severe case of female hysteria, had been sent away years ago to a private sanatorium in the north. A tragedy, they all agreed, nodding slowly, but a necessary mercy. Yet, the whispers told a different tale, a darker one. They spoke of the girls not being sent away, but of simply vanishing, of the house on the hill falling into a profound and unnatural silence. The stories were vague, formless things, rooted in the superstitious soil of the mountains. They said the girls were inbred, a term spat with a mixture of pity and revulsion, cursed by the very blood that was Gideon Blackwood's obsession. They said a horrible justice had visited that house. But what that justice was, and upon whom it had fallen, no one would say. For Alastair Finch, a man of logic and fact, these folk tales were a morbid curiosity, the product of isolation and ignorance. He was a doctor, concerned with the tangible afflictions of the flesh, not the spectral sickness of a town soul. He could not yet understand that in a place like Morning Creek, the two were inextricably, fatally intertwined. He would soon learn that the most virulent disease was not consumption or influenza, but a secret. And the house on the hill was its heart, pumping a slow, black poison through the veins of the entire community. The town was waiting. The house was waiting. And the truth, buried but not dead, was waiting for a curious hand to begin to dig. The call came on a Tuesday, a day of low, oppressive clouds that seemed to physically press down upon the rooftops. A young boy, breathless and wide-eyed, was sent to fetch him. Mr. Blackwood, the boy panted. He took a turn. The summons was expected, yet it carried the weight of a royal decree. As Finch packed his medical bag, he felt a strange prickle of apprehension. This was not just a house call, it was an audience. The path up to Blackwood Manor was steep and uninviting, the gravel crunching under Finch's boots like tiny bones. The air grew colder, the scent of wood smoke replaced by the smell of wet stone and rot. The house loomed, larger and more imposing up close. The intricate ironwork of the fence was rusted into spears of angry orange. The stone walls were webbed with dark ivy, and the windows, even those on the ground floor, were unervingly dark. A grim, stoic manservant, as ancient and gray as the house itself, led him into a cavernous hall where the silence was a physical presence. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the thin shafts of light piercing the gloom. The place felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, curated by a single living occupant. He was led to a library, a room paneled in dark, almost black wood, and lined with books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in a century. And there, in a high-backed leather chair by a low-burning fire, sat Gideon Blackwood. The man was a pillar of Old Testament authority, a mane of iron-gray hair, a severe, trimmed beard, and eyes the color of a winter sky. He was not a large man, but he radiated an intensity, a compressed power that filled the room. He greeted Finch with a voice that was smooth and cultured, yet held an undercurrent of gravel, of command. "Dr. Finch," he said, his lips barely moving, "I am told you are a man of science, a modern man." Finch, feeling suddenly young and inadequate, simply nodded. "I practice medicine as I was taught, sir." Gideon's ailment was minor, a persistent tremor in his left hand and a general malaise. As Finch conducted his examination, he was acutely aware of the man's piercing stare. It was the gaze of a predator, assessing, judging. But it was the house itself that screamed at the doctor's senses. While Gideon spoke of scripture and the moral failings of the modern world, Finch's eyes cataloged the dissonant details. The fine layer of dust on everything, except for the path from this room to what he assumed was the kitchen and bedroom. The faint, almost imperceptible scratches marring the thick oak door leading to the hallway, concentrated around the lock. And most disturbing of all, the door he passed on his way in, the one that must lead to the cellar. It was banded with heavy iron straps, and a thick, formidable bolt, rusted but clearly still in use, was slid firmly into place. Who bolts a cellar door from the outside, as if imprisoning something within? When he was done, Gideon waved a dismissive hand at Finch's prescriptions. "The frailties of the flesh are a trial, doctor, a test of the spirit." As the manservant showed him out, Finch paused, feigning a simple curiosity. He gestured toward the cellar door. "Must have a terrible problem with damp, to need such fortifications." The servant's face, already a mask of indifference, seemed to harden into granite. "Mr. Blackwood is a man who values order, doctor. He keeps things where they belong." The words were simple, yet they hung in the dead air of the hallway with the finality of a slammed coffin lid. Walking back down the hill, away from the oppressive shadow of the manor, Alastair Finch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He had touched the surface of the town's great secret, and it felt cold and hard, like a tombstone. The official story of the hysterical daughters sent away for treatment now seemed like a flimsy piece of stagecraft, a lie so thin it was transparent. The tremor in Gideon Blackwood's hand was a simple medical fact, but the iron bolt on the cellar door, that was a symptom of a much deeper, much sicker pathology. A pathology he was now compelled, against all common sense, to diagnose. His discreet inquiries began the next day at the general store, a place that served as the town's nerve center. While purchasing tins of coffee and kerosene, Finch casually mentioned his visit to the manor. He remarked on Gideon Blackwood's impressive library, his commanding presence. He was testing the waters, casting a line into the murky depths of the town's consciousness. The reaction was immediate and uniform. The storekeeper, a man named Silas, suddenly became intensely focused on rearranging a display of canned peaches. The two old men sitting by the pot-bellied stove abruptly ceased their conversation, their eyes fixed on the checkerboard between them. The air grew thick with unspoken warnings. "He's a pillar of this community, doctor," Silas said to the peaches. "A godly man, keeps to himself since his troubles." The word troubles was offered up like a piece of spoiled meat, meant to be examined briefly and then discarded. Finch pressed gently. It must have been a terrible blow, losing his wife and then having to send his daughters away. Alara and Maeve, was it? The Reverend mentioned them. A drop crate would have made less noise. Silas stopped his shuffling and turned, his face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. Some sorrows are best left undisturbed, doctor. Like sleeping dogs. The threat, though couched in folksy wisdom, was unmistakable. One of the old men at the stove coughed, a dry, deliberate sound. A man's family is his own concern, especially a man like Gideon Blackwood. The message was clear. The subject was closed, nailed shut and buried. His next stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was a large, heavy man whose uniform seemed permanently strained at the seams. He sat with his boots on his desk, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. He listened to Finch's carefully phrased concerns with a look of profound boredom. Finch spoke of the isolation of the manor, Gideon's apparent ill health, and the strangeness of a man living alone in such a vast, decaying place. He did not mention the cellar door. Not yet. Doctor, the sheriff sighed, finally lowering his feet to the floor with a thud. Let me explain how things work here in Morning Creek. We are a simple, God-fearing folk. We respect our elders. And there is no man more respected than Gideon Blackwood. He practically built this town. The mill, the mines most people here owe their livelihoods to him. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He had 2 daughters, unwell girls, troubled in the head, you understand, a bad seed in them. He did the only thing a loving father could do. He sought professional help for them, far away from here. It caused him great pain, a pain he does not need a newcomer digging up. The term unwell girls was delivered with a particular, unpleasant emphasis. It was a diagnosis and a condemnation in one. When Finch suggested that, as a doctor, he might be able to review their case, perhaps offer a more modern perspective, the sheriff's veneer of weary patience cracked. Their case is closed, Finch, he snapped, the knife pausing in its work. It is a private family matter, and you would do well to remember that you are here to treat coughs and set bones, not to poke your nose into the settled grief of your betters. Are we clear? The dismissal was absolute. The wall of silence was not made of whispers and evasions. It was a fortress built of fear, obligation, and a shared, ugly complicity. The preacher, Reverend Thompson, was the final stone in that wall. A thin, nervous man with hands that constantly fluttered like trapped birds. He spoke in circular platitudes. He lauded Gideon's piety, his generous donations to the church. When Finch brought up Alara and Maeve, the Reverend's eyes darted towards the stained glass window, as if seeking divine intervention. A terrible trial, he murmured. A father's heaviest cross. The sins of the parents visited upon the children, you know. Sometimes the blood itself is tainted. There was again that notion of corrupted blood, of an impurity that went deeper than simple illness. The town hadn't just accepted the story. They had embroidered it with their own brand of grim, theological justification. The girls were not just sick, they were cursed. It was a convenient belief, one that absolved them all of any responsibility, any need for compassion. It was then that Alistair Finch understood. This was not a conspiracy of silence. It was a conspiracy of belief. They had all chosen to believe the simple, cruel story because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. To question the fate of Alara and Maeve Blackwood was to question the very foundation of their town, to question the goodness of their benefactor, the authority of their law, the piety of their church. It was to question their own reflection in the mirror. And so they chose silence, a damning, suffocating silence that Finch, with his outsider's morality and scientist's curiosity, now felt duty-bound to shatter. He was no longer just a doctor. He was an investigator, and his patient was the truth. The breakthrough came not from a man of law or God, but from the one person in Morning Creek more ostracized than a prying newcomer. Her name was Elspeth, and she lived in a small, isolated cabin at the edge of the woods, a place the town children dared each other to run past after dark. She was the local midwife, a repository of folk knowledge and herbal remedies that the townspeople publicly scorned but secretly sought out when the doctor's powders and tinctures failed. They called her a hag, a witch, but they knew her hands had brought most of them into this world. Finch was called to her cabin one night by a frantic father whose infant son was racked with a fever that Finch's quinine could not break. He found Elspeth, a woman whose age was impossible to guess, with a face like a roadmap of a hard life and eyes that held a startling, fierce intelligence, calmly mashing herbs in a stone bowl. She watched him work, her silence more unnerving than any criticism. As the child's fever raged and Finch's modern methods proved useless, the father looked from the doctor to the old woman with desperation. With a curt nod from Finch, an admission of defeat, Elspeth took over. She administered a foul-smelling poultice and forced a few drops of a dark liquid between the baby's lips. Then she sat and she waited. By dawn, the fever had broken. The child slept peacefully. In the quiet morning light, humbled and intrigued, Finch stayed behind. He helped Elspeth tidy her small, cluttered cabin, a place filled with the smells of drying herbs and wood smoke. He asked about the plants she used, treating her knowledge with the respect he would afford a fellow physician. For the first time since his arrival, he was not being met with suspicion. He was being seen. "The mountain provides its own medicine, doctor," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. "For the body, and sometimes for the soul." It was an opening, a crack in a wall he had been searching for. He took the risk. "I was up at the Blackwood place," he began, his voice low. Elspeth's hands, which had been deftly tying bundles of lavender, stilled. "That's not a place for healing," she said, her eyes on her work. "That's a place of endings." Finch pressed on, telling her about Gideon, about the strange, silent house, about the whispers of the vanished daughters. He spoke of the town's unyielding silence. He did not ask her to betray a confidence. He simply laid out the puzzle as he saw it, a man of science baffled by a problem he could not quantify. Elspeth listened, her gaze distant. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. "You have a good heart, doctor," she said at last. "It will get you hurt here." "The truth shouldn't hurt," Finch replied, the naivety of his own words sounding hollow even to him. A dry, mirthless chuckle escaped Elspeth's lips. "The truth is a blade. It all depends on who is holding it and where they aim it. Gideon Blackwood has been holding it in this valley for 40 years. He aims it at anyone who looks him in the eye for too long." She finally looked at him, her eyes seeming to strip away his clinical detachment, seeing the moral conviction beneath. "You want to know about the girls? Alara and Maeve? I brought them into this world. I held them before he did." Her voice softened, a flicker of ancient grief in her tone. "They were not unwell. They were bright, fierce. They had their mother's fire. That was the problem. Gideon doesn't want fire. He wants mirrors, things that will reflect his own glory back at him." She told him of Gideon's wife, a gentle woman from outside the mountains, who had slowly been suffocated by his piety and his obsession with his own bloodline, which he saw as pure, noble, almost royal. An obsession that curdled into something monstrous when she gave him only daughters. He saw them as failures, Elspeth rasped, her voice thick with old anger. Flawed vessels. He'd talk of the taint, the weakness of their mother's blood mixing with his. He twisted the Bible into a whip and used it on all of them. Finch felt a cold dread crystallize in his gut. This was the source of the town's ugly rumor. It came from Gideon himself. Their mother knew. Elspeth continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. She saw the darkness in him growing. She was terrified of what he would do to them, especially after she was gone. She tried to protect them. She taught them to read, to think. She gave them a world beyond his sermons. She stood up and walked to a rickety old chest in the corner. From it, she pulled a small, worn wooden box. "She gave me this a week before the consumption finally took her. She said if anything ever happened, if anyone ever came asking, I was to tell them where to look." She didn't give him the box. She just told him. He keeps her room locked, the one at the top of the West Wing stairs. He hasn't been in it since she died. He fears her memory as much as he loved her. But she kept a journal. "Doctor." She wrote everything down. "Find it. The key is hidden. Look for the loose stone in the fireplace of the master bedroom, the one that doesn't match the others. The information was a jolt, a current of electricity through the stagnant mystery. It was the key, not just to a room, but to the entire sordid history. As Finch prepared to leave, Elspeth grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Be careful, Doctor. That house is a tomb. Some things, once unearthed, can never be put back." Finch nodded, his mind already racing. The image of the bolted cellar door flashed in his mind, but now it was overlaid with Elspeth's words. "He keeps things where they belong." The next Sunday was a gift to Providence. A cold, driving rain swept through the valley, turning the dirt roads to mud and keeping most of Morning Creek, including Gideon Blackwood and his manservant, confined to the morning's church service. It was a longer sermon than usual, the Reverend Thompson expounding at length on the virtues of patience in the face of tribulation. For Alastair Finch, who feigned a sudden headache and slipped out the back of the church, it was a window. He moved with a purpose that bordered on reckless, his medical bag containing not just his usual instruments, but a small crowbar and a length of wire. The walk up to the manor was a grim pilgrimage. The rain plastered his hair to his scalp and soaked his coat, but he barely felt the cold. The house seemed to watch him approach, its windows weeping black streaks down the stone face. The front door was an impossibility, but Elspeth's knowledge had provided another way. A small pantry window at the back of the house, its latch long rusted and broken. It was a tight squeeze, but he managed it, tumbling ungracefully onto a cold stone floor that smelled of dust and mice. The silence inside was absolute, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of his own heart. He was a trespasser, a violator of the town's most sacred tabernacle of secrets. He moved quickly, a ghost in Gideon's tomb, up the grand, creaking staircase to the master bedroom. It was a sparse, cold room, dominated by a large, unadorned bed. The fireplace was a gaping black mouth. He ran his hands along the stones, his fingers searching, and there it was, a stone slightly recessed, its color a shade lighter than the others. He worked his fingernails into the crack and pulled. It came loose with a grating sound, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside lay a single, ornate iron key, cold to the touch. His heart hammered against his ribs. He crossed the hall to the door at the top of the west wing. It was locked, as Elspeth had said. The key slid into the lock with a well-oiled click. The door swung open on silent hinges, releasing a breath of trapped air, redolent with the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and dried roses. This was her room. Unlike the rest of the house, it felt lived in, though it was covered in a shroud of dust. A sewing basket sat by a chair, a silverback brush on the vanity. It was a room frozen in time, a silent testament to a life extinguished. The journal was where Elspeth had hinted it might be, tucked beneath a loose floorboard under the heavy mahogany wardrobe. It was a simple leather-bound volume, its pages filled with an elegant, looping script. He sat in the chair by the window, the gray light of the storm illuminating the pages, and began to read. The voice that emerged from the ink was that of a woman, Sarah Blackwood, drowning in slow motion. The early entries were full of hope. Her love for Gideon, her awe at the stark beauty of the mountains, her joy at the birth of their first daughter, Elara, and then Maeve. But slowly, insidiously, the tone began to change. Asterisk October 12th, 1888. Gideon preached to the girls again tonight. He read from Leviticus, his voice like stones dropping into a well. He speaks of bloodlines, of purity. He looks at them not as his children, but as a flawed crop. I see the fear in Alara's eyes. She is too smart. She understands his disappointment. Asterisk the diary chronicled Gideon's descent from stern patriarch to tyrannical zealot. He forbade the girls from playing with the town children, from reading any book but the Bible. He saw the world outside his valley as a pit of corruption, and his own blood, diluted by Sarah's, as a stain to be scoured away. He was building a prison around them, brick by pious brick. Asterisk May 3rd, 1890. Maeve has a gift for carving. She found a piece of soft pine and has carved a perfect, tiny bird. She showed it to her father, her face alight with pride. He took it from her, and threw it into the fire. Idle hands are the devil's workshop, he said. He did not see her pride. He only saw the carving as a distraction from prayer. I retrieved the charred bird from the ashes after he was asleep. I will keep it for her. It is a piece of her soul. Asterisk, the entries grew more desperate as Sarah's own health began to fail. The cough that would eventually kill her was a constant companion, a punctuation mark in her litany of fear. She wrote of Alara's defiance, a quiet, simmering rebellion, and Maeve's retreat into a silent, watchful world. They were two halves a whole, one fire, one ice. Asterisk, September 21st, 1891. The doctor says I do not have long. The knowledge is a strange relief. But the terror for my girls is an iron band around my chest. Gideon spoke last night of cleansing, of purifying the house. He was looking at the cellar door. He has been down there, reinforcing it. He speaks of hysteria as a spiritual rot that must be contained, cut out, before it can spread. He is not talking about sending them away. He's talking about burying them alive. I pray that I am wrong. I pray that God is more merciful than my husband. Asterisk, the last entry was a frantic, blotched scrawl dated a week before her death. Asterisk, he knows they listen. He knows they think for themselves. He called them my little vipers of intellect. He said he would break them. He would purge the weakness, my weakness, from them, until all that was left was his will. His blood. He will not let them leave. He will not let them live. Oh God, forgive me for leaving them alone with him. Asterisk, Alastair Finch closed the diary, his hands trembling. The pages fell hot, radioactive with a dead woman's terror. The whispers of the town, the evasions of the sheriff, were all obscene footnotes to this terrible central T.